Hi, I am Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
It was upon a raw November morning, when the fog had settled over Baker Street as a damp quilt and the milkman's bell went about like a lost chime, that a case arrived which, for intricacy and audacity, might stand among those which I have already set before the public. My companion, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, had been silent for an hour, lying coiled in the armchair with his long limbs gathered like a mantis, and his keen grey eyes half closed, when the door below sounded with an urgency that sent Mrs. Hudson scurrying. A moment later there entered a lady who, despite her youth, bore about her the pallor of a sleepless vigil. She was dressed for the street rather than for calling, no bonnet, but a veil thrown back, her gloves mismatched, and on the left one a dark smear which, upon subsequent inspection, proved not to be London's honest grime, but a thin crescent of dull metallic dust. She curtsied, then straightened, with a resolve that was admirable to behold. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she said, "and Dr. Watson, I am Miss Evelyn Charteris. Though by noon I was to be Mrs. Evelyn St. Clair, there has been a villainy in my father's house." Holmes had risen at the first syllable, and now indicated the chair by the fire. "Pray be seated, Miss Charteris. A villainy already, I perceive, from the scent of verbena and beeswax upon your cloak and the faint powdering upon your glove, that we deal with a matter set in a room where a mirror was recently polished and a trinket crushed. The fog has stitched your hem with moisture. You came in a cab from west of Regent Street, but ran the last yards. Tell me the rest." The poor girl's eyes widened, though I had long ceased to be astonished by my friend's anticipations. "It is all true, sir, save that I walked, for the cabman would not turn into our square, but yes, crushed. My bridal crown, sir, my mother's tiara passed down since the Hanoverian days, lies in fragments upon the floor of my dressing-room, and with it, oh, I scarce know how to say it, blood, Mr. Holmes, and a single pearl, stained as though by a cruel thumb." Holmes clasped his hands behind him and began his habitual pacing. "A tiara shattered, blood upon the scene, and a pearl marked, when?" "Just past 5 of the clock. I had risen before the house, for I could not sleep. I went to look once more at the crown, which had been laid out with my gown. The door was ajar, though I am certain I closed it last night, and the lamp had guttered as if a draught had teased it. Then I saw—" She stopped and gripped her reticule until the seams protested. My maid, Annie Rowntree, was nowhere to be found, nor my cousin, Mr. Lionel Charteris, who arrived unexpected at dusk and was given the small room on the landing, and my fiancé, Mr. Arthur St. Clair, had sent a note at midnight begging pardon for a delay this morning on account of business with his solicitor. "Inspector."
"Lestrade," said Holmes, without turning his head. I started, for only now did I perceive that a second set of footsteps had halted outside. The door opened to admit the well-known ferret-featured officer of Scotland Yard, grave and tidy as ever, a spot of moisture upon his bowler, declaring he had been listening at the landing rather than risking an untidy entry. "You're the very devil, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, neither denying nor blushing. "I'm here on a delicate matter at the request of Sir Peregrine Charteris, Miss Evelyn's father. If the lady consults you, I can hardly object. Yet I must warn you, this is no common burglary. There's a deal of blood for a broken trinket, and a missing maid who, by all accounts, had reason to dislike her betters." Miss Charteris rose, alarmed. "Annie would never—" "Pray," Holmes interrupted softly, "relate the particulars in their order. Begin last night." The young lady gathered herself. "We supped at 9. There were 6 at table, my father, my aunt, Lady Agnes, my cousin Lionel, Mr. St. Clair, myself, and Mr. Phineas Vale, my father's man of business. There was some dispute. Idle words only between Mr. Vale and Mr. St. Clair regarding the conditions of my dowry and the future of a small estate in Sussex which my mother left me. Mr. St. Clair is to put it in trust for our household. Mr. Vale wishes it secured elsewhere. The talk grew warm, but ended with apologies. At 10:30 I retired. Annie brushed my hair. We set the tiara upon its velvet, as we have done each night this week. Oh, doctor, I cannot say why, save that a bride's fancies are many. And I locked the door. I placed the key in the dish by the lamp. "The key was there this morning?" asked Holmes. The dish was overturned upon the floor. The key lay by the skirting, as though disturbed in haste. Holmes had paused at the hearthrug, his gaze fixed upon a point that existed not in our rooms, but in whatever chamber his mind had entered. "Windows?" "Two," said Lestrade, drawing a notebook. "Both latched from within. There's a balcony, but old and iron. No sign of a ladder or footprints on the wet tiles, save one scuff which might be anything. The lock on the door shows scratches, but from the left-hand side." "From within, then," murmured Holmes. "What of the fragments?" Lestrade cocked his head. "Odd as a barber's bill. The tiara's arch is in 3 pieces, as if struck just off its centre. But there's grit upon the shards, black grit, like the soot you get from a carriage lamp, and a smear on the velvet that's neither polish nor blood. The pearl—" "Yes," cried Miss Charteris, "has a little crescent of dullness on it, like it's been pinched with a tool. There's blood, 2 distinct patches, one near the dressing table, a second by the threshold. Not much, mind, enough for a cut, not a murder. A wedding crown, a solicitor's delay."
A cousin who arrives unannounced, a factor who argues about a trust, and a servant who vanishes before dawn, Holmes recited, as if turning each bead upon a string. "You omitted, Miss Charteris, a detail of perfume I detected the moment you entered. Verbena, common enough. But beneath it, a ghost of heliotrope. Your aunt's preferred scent, if I am not mistaken." Miss Charteris coloured. "Lady Agnes embraced me last night rather coldly. She thought the tiara an ostentation." Holmes's mouth twitched. "And someone, after the event, handled the remnants with hands that had lately engaged a metal polish. Thus, the dust upon your glove. You tried to gather them?" "I could not help myself," she whispered. "But I swear, Mr. Holmes, there was a sound before I entered, the faintest chime, as if a watch spring ran down." "A coachman's repeater, perhaps," said Lestrade. "Or a music box," Holmes murmured. "Miss Charteris, your fiancé's note, have you brought it?" She produced a folded slip. Holmes sniffed it, held it to the window's meagre light, and gave it the briefest glance from left to right. Type set upon a clerk's machine of the older pattern. The E is chipped and the ribbon dry. Addressed from his club, and yet the club's porter, if asked, will deny that Mr. St. Clair was abroad after 11. He is not a man to send a note at midnight on the eve of his wedding, unless compelled. Very good. "Compelled?" Lestrade repeated. "By whom?" "By whoever arranged a scene in which a tiara must be broken, a door seem forced, and a loyal maid be made to vanish." Holmes turned to Miss Charteris with a courtly inclination of the head. "You did wisely to come. Doctor your hat. Lestrade, if Sir Peregrine invited you, you may announce us without trampling my footprints. Miss Charteris, dry your eyes. We shall go at once to Belgrave Square." "Belgrave Mews," she corrected with a shaky smile. "My father disdains the pretensions of the square. We are at number 7, the corner house. Mr. Holmes, if you can restore my crown's honour, even if it be in fragments, I shall be in your debt for ever." Holmes's eyes, which had been distant, grew suddenly bright. "We shall attempt, at least, to restore its truth. For I suspect, Miss Charteris, that the honour of that crown was shattered long before the gold. With that enigmatic pledge, he caught up his coat and violin case — he would not be parted from the latter on any expedition — and led us into the London morning, where the fog swirled like gauze around the street lamps and the city's thousand secrets whispered behind curtained panes. As we descended, I thought of the smudged pearl and the 2 patches of blood, of a left-handed scratch on a lock and a balcony no man would trust, and of the faint running down of some hidden spring at the very heart of the matter. The cab bore us westward through fog, and Miss Charteris, opposite us, wrung her hands until the seams of her gloves complained. Holmes lay long and lax in the corner, yet his eyes travelled from the damp at her hem to the metallic dust upon her left glove and the faint scar on her reticule clasp. "You brushed a freshly painted rail," he murmured, and ran down stone steps that sweat in such weather. "There is time still to set the order right." We drew up at a sober corner house whose steps shone with moisture. Sir Peregrine Charteris received us in a hall of black wainscot and dim portraits. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I have admitted Inspector Lestrade. I do not invite spectacle." "Nor do I supply it," Holmes returned. "With your leave, the dressing-room first." It was a compact chamber in the French taste. On the velvet tray a crescent smear dulled the nap. 3 bent segments of gold and many bright scales lay scattered. 2 small stains of dried blood freckled the carpet. Holmes touched the smear and raised his finger to my nose. "Rancid lamp oil," said he. He knelt where the fallen key had been found and teased up a grey crumb with his blade. "Carbolic soap." Our intruder feared the tiny clink of a key in a dish. "Mark the second blood-stain at the threshold," he added. "The pile pales round it. A cloth was applied after the cut. He bled, then bound. Who bound him?" He slid the bolts and tested the balcony. Upon the outer rail his nail raised a faint black streak. "Coarse gritty cloth," he said. "Something wrapped was lowered outward. The scene is meant for an audience." "Annie Rowntree is faithful," Miss Charteris said. "That is my hope," said Holmes. "Her room." We mounted by a narrow stair to the servants' floor. Annie's chamber was neat as a schoolroom, the bed unslept in. A chipped scent bottle breathed cheap lavender. On the washstand a darned glove bore a brownish spot. In the grate a cinder of paper held to its shape. Holmes lifted it with the tongs and blew. A ragged syllable survived. "Borrow," he said. He examined the glove. Not blood. Varnish from a music-box barrel. He opened the small trunk. Horsehair, coarse string, and a snapped inferior clasp that once held a false pearl. "Annie would not steal," Miss Charteris cried. "I accuse no one," said Holmes. On a nail hung a length of string, frayed and powdered as if it had shared a pocket with coal dust. "Strong enough for parcels," he observed, and we descended. In the landing we met Lady Agnes, pale and precise, heliotrope preceding her like a herald. Mr. Lionel Charteris came as she ended, handsome and slack, his left wrist swathed with black silk. "A fencing accident," he said lightly. Holmes requested the hand and turned it palm upward. The thumb showed a shallow fresh cut, edges clean as from a thin tool. "Your foils are sharpened unusually," he observed. "I broke a glass," Lionel muttered. "Mr. Phineas Vale, the family's—"
Man of business appeared with documents and a cuff marked by a comet tail of black grit. "My office fire smokes," he said, brushing at it. "Not all chimneys deposit the same ash," Holmes replied. He asked for Mr. St. Clair's midnight note. Miss Charteris produced it. An elderly machine, its E crippled, a ribbon more dust than ink, and the faintest odour of oil and carbolic, Holmes said after a glance. "Addressed from the club, though the porter will swear to no posting after 11. Your office owns such a machine, Mr. Vale? So do many, said Vale, ours among them. Holmes lifted a book-shaped music box from the mantel, wound it, and set it down. 2 thin notes rang and died. It was wound to mask a small sound, the lift of this latch by one already within, or the slip of string upon iron. Sir Peregrine's hand trembled upon the chair back. Do you accuse my household? I accuse arrangements, Holmes replied. Lestrade, post a constable at the Mews to watch for a bandaged thumb and a girl with coal at the roots of her hair. Watson, remain with Miss Charteris and suffer no private parley. I must visit Mr. St. Clair's club and Mr. Vale's office. He stooped to the velvet once more. A single pearl lay there, dull along one crescent, bright elsewhere. He held it to the window and breathed upon it. A smear bloomed and vanished. Thumb and lamp oil, he murmured. A man pinched this with hands that had lately touched a lantern. A second touch is cleaner, as if from a cloth. We must learn whose cloth. He placed the pearl in his pocket-book and gave Miss Charteris a look, nearly kind. Take courage. The honour of your crown has suffered from ignorance more than malice. Let us correct the former before we punish the latter. With that he caught up his cane and violin case, and the fog received us like a veil closing upon a stage. Holmes walked at a rapid pace, his cane tapping briskly as we pressed through the damp London haze. He was silent for most of the journey, the violin case swinging lightly in his hand, his gaze fixed inward upon the architecture of thought that only he could see. I have come to recognize that state of mind in him. His lips compressing, his brows lifting and falling imperceptibly, as though the puzzle itself whispered answers he was not yet ready to share. At last we arrived at the discreet facade of the Albemarle Club, where Mr. Arthur St. Clair was said to have written his midnight note. The porter, a stout fellow with whiskers damp from fog, regarded us with the weariness of one who has been asked too many questions already. Mr. St. Clair, said Holmes curtly. Was he here past 11 last night? The porter shook his head. No, sir. He left with another gentleman a little before 10. No sign of him since. And the letter that bears this address, Holmes said, producing the folded slip Miss Charteris had brought. Was it delivered?
From here? The man frowned. Impossible, sir. Our box was emptied at 9 and no late notes were collected. That was not sent from the Albemarle. Holmes's eyes glinted with satisfaction rather than surprise. Precisely as I thought, thank you. He turned away with that abruptness that leaves men uncertain whether they have been dismissed or not, and we took again to the street. You perceive, Watson, he said as we walked, how easily the lie reveals itself. Our bridegroom was neither here nor the author of that note. It is a forgery designed to explain his absence at dawn and to throw suspicion in convenient directions. But forged by whom? I asked. Vale, who has access to such a machine? Or Lionel, who bears the wound upon his hand? Holmes gave a thin smile. You err in asking who could forge it. Nearly any clerk might. Ask instead who required it. Who had most to gain by removing Mr. St. Clair from the stage at that particular hour? Before I could frame a reply, Holmes stopped sharply before a narrow office with grimy windows and brass letters just visible through the fog. Phineas Vale, Estates and Securities. Inside, the gas burned dim, and a young assistant, pale and ink-stained, rose at our entrance. Mr. Vale is within, he stammered, and soon the man himself appeared from the inner chamber, his thin lips already forming the semblance of a smile. Mr. Holmes, said he, and Dr. Watson, to what do I owe the pleasure? Holmes, without preamble, walked to the writing desk where a Remington typewriter squatted upon a stand. He pressed one key after another, and the paper clattered beneath the iron arms. The letter A left a broken half-mark, dry and faint. Holmes tore away the paper, compared it with St. Clair's note, and laid the two together. "The very same machine," he said, softly, but with an edge that made the assistant swallow. Vale coloured, but he did not flinch. "Our office machine is used for dozens of letters daily, Mr. Holmes. Shall I be held to account for each one?" Perhaps the porter of the club, perhaps a servant, sought its convenience. "Perhaps," said Holmes. "And yet you, sir, were one of 6 at table. You quarrelled with Sinclair over money, and at 10:30 retired here to your office, where you might contrive this very note. Did you meet anyone upon the way?" Vale's eyes flickered. "I had a cab." Holmes bent suddenly to the ashtray upon the desk and lifted a half-burnt scrap between his tweezers. He handed it to me. By squinting, I could still discern the words, "Crown? Insure? No risk." The remainder was consumed. "You insure the Charterist jewels, I believe?" Holmes inquired lightly. "Only as a matter of business," Vale said stiffly. "Business," Holmes murmured, "often wears the mask of accident, but we will not intrude further for the moment." He replaced his hat and, with a nod to the trembling clerk, swept out into the night air. We walked in silence for a dozen paces before I asked the question that had gnawed at me since the dressing-room. "Holmes, do you believe St. Clair has been abducted? That crown smashed, the note forged. What if he has come to harm?" Holmes looked at me sharply. "On the contrary, my dear Watson, I believe St. Clair is at this moment not dead but hidden with his knowledge, perhaps even by his will. Consider, blood sufficient for a cut, yet not for death, scratches from the inside of a lock, a pearl pinched as by a tool, not torn by violence. All these argue staging, not slaughter. Then the maid Annie?" "Ah," said Holmes, "there lies the key. She is no thief, but she has been made to appear one. Whether she fled of her own accord or was carried off, we must discover. But I will hazard this much. She saw what she was not meant to see. She, not St. Clair, is the true danger to our culprit." As he spoke, a hansom rattled up beside us. Within, Lestrade leaned out, breath puffing white. "Holmes, they've found something at the Charterist's house, a scrap of cloth snagged on the balcony rail, black silk torn at the edge. Matches the bandage Lionel wears." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Excellent. Come, Watson, the circle tightens." We clambered into the cab, the horse plunging through fog and lamplight. As we sped back towards Belgrave Mews, I felt the threads of the case weaving tighter around us, the forged note, the vanished maid, the bandaged hand, the sundered crown. And in the midst of it, Sherlock Holmes, his gaze fixed straight ahead, lips moving faintly as if rehearsing the music of deduction he alone could hear. The cab lurched to a halt before the sombre facade of No. 7 Belgrave Mews, the horse steaming in the damp air. Holmes sprang lightly down, his long coat sweeping behind him, and motioned us with an impatience that allowed no hesitation. Lestrade followed close at his side, holding between his fingers a folded handkerchief within which a scrap of silk lay preserved like some sinister specimen. The hall was dim, but Sir Peregrine awaited us, his countenance more ashen than before, as though each hour added fresh weight to his fears. Lady Agnes lingered at the stair, her perfume announcing her even before her pale face appeared in the gloom. Lionel stood rigid at the drawing-room threshold, his left hand concealed within its black covering, his eyes flickering to the parcel Lestrade bore. Holmes wasted no words on courtesy. He advanced, and with a gesture demanded the scrap. Holding it up to the lamp, he examined the weave, then drew suddenly near to Lionel. "Permit me, sir," he said, and with a swift hand seized the youth's wrist. The bandage slipped, revealing a shallow cut across the thumb's base. The torn edge of silk dangled loosely. Holmes pressed the scrap against it where it fitted with cruel exactness. Lionel flushed and stammered, "It proves."
Nothing. Only that I caught the stuff upon a nail this morning. I was careless. Indeed, Holmes said coldly. A nail which juts from the balcony rail. Pray explain why your sleeve or cuff bore no tear, but only the binding upon your hand, and why your cut bears the unmistakable look of a tool, narrow and precise rather than the jagged edge of broken glass. It is poor policy, Mr. Lionel, to cloak accident in falsehood, for the falsehood proves the intent. Sir Peregrine turned upon his nephew with fury. Have you brought this shame upon our house, Lionel? Lionel, pale and cornered, lifted his chin with an air that sought bravado. You condemn me too hastily, uncle. If I handled the tiara, it was only from curiosity. I had admired it since boyhood. When I touched it last night, it slipped from its case. I sought to hide the damage before it was discovered. The rest, the maid's flight, the forged note, these are beyond me. Holmes regarded him with the same expression I have seen him bestow upon a pawn blocking his chessboard. An explanation both neat and insufficient. You forget, sir, that your presence in the dressing room requires entrance. The lock was scratched from within. Unless you carry a gift for invisibility, you were not alone there. Who assisted you? Lionel faltered, but before he could frame an answer, Lady Agnes's voice cut through, sharp as frost. Enough, Mr. Holmes. You have harried this family quite enough. Annie Rowntree is a sly creature, jealous of her betters. She doubtless took the crown herself and, when thwarted, fled. Lionel's foolish tampering may have made matters worse, but to drag his name in mud before strangers is intolerable. Holmes turned to her with a bow that was more dagger than courtesy. Lady Agnes, your zeal to defend your nephew outpaces both reason and charity. The heliotrope upon your gown betrays your nearness to Miss Charteris last night, yet you would deny any part. And yet if Annie fled, why does her room show no sign of disorder save the remains of a paper mentioning borrow? Why is her glove marked with the varnish of a music box barrel, an object she had no business handling? And why should Lionel's hand bear a wound too precisely cut to match any clumsy fall? Lestrade, impatient of rhetoric, broke in. Mr. Lionel, you'll accompany me to the yard until these matters are settled. He stepped forward, but Holmes raised a hand. Not yet. You would arrest too soon and thus lose the truth. Allow me one more liberty, Sir Peregrine. The music box upon your mantle, may I? Without waiting for reply, Holmes lifted the box and wound it. A thin air tinkled, halting after 2 notes. It was wound last night to mask sound, Holmes said. But note, here upon the underside is a trace of oil, the same odour I detected upon the pearl. A lantern was handled, its oil smeared, then this box touched. Whoever staged the scene employed both. He
looked hard at Lionel. You handled the tiara, yes, but you were not its destroyer. You were, rather, the pawn sent first into the room, your blunder masking another's purpose. Whose purpose, we shall soon learn. Sir Peregrine's head sank into his hands. Holmes, I implore you, if this is family business, let it be confined. Do not make of it a scandal. My duty, said Holmes, is to truth, not to reputation, and truth declares that Lionel was but an instrument. The true hand lies elsewhere, one that forged a note, contrived an absence, and now holds the key to both the maid's fate and Mr. St. Clair's disappearance. At that instant, the front door opened, and a draught of fog swept through. A constable entered, saluting Lestrade. "We've traced the girl, sir. Annie Rowntree. A neighbour swears she was seen at dawn, hurrying towards the embankment. She carried a small parcel, tied with coarse string. No one has seen her since." Holmes's eyes kindled. "Watson, you will join me at the embankment at once. Lestrade, hold Lionel, but charge him not. His guilt is incomplete. Sir Peregrine, Miss Charteris must remain within your care, for events will move swiftly now. I believe the fate of both Annie and your intended son-in-law will be determined by what we find along the river." Without further word, he seized his cane and strode into the night, the rest of us following like actors drawn unwillingly deeper into a play whose author alone knew the ending. And as we descended the steps once more into the London mist, I felt the weight of the case pressing upon us, each clue a bead upon an unseen thread drawing tighter toward some hidden centre. The mist lay heavy along the embankment, the lamps blurred into pale orbs, and the river lapped with a sluggish murmur against the stone. Holmes pressed forward with his long, urgent stride, his eyes scanning every shadow as though each figure that emerged might hold the key to the mystery. I followed close, chilled to the bone by the fog's damp fingers, while Lestrade trudged at our heels with a constable whose lantern cut narrow arcs across the pavement. The hour was not late, yet the emptiness of that quarter lent it an air of midnight, broken only by the cry of a watchman in the distance and the rattling of an unseen cart. Holmes paused at an alcove where the steps descended towards the river. He stooped, touched the railing, and rubbed his fingers together. "String fibre," he murmured. "Rough common, such as was found in Annie's room. And here, Watson, your lantern." I directed the beam and saw, caught upon the stone edge, a shred of paper dampened into pulp, yet bearing still the faintest stroke of ink. Holmes prized it free with his tweezers, examining it with sharp intensity. "A receipt, I would wager, from some pawnbroker or stationer. Annie carried papers in that parcel, not jewels. The crown was never here." Lestrade grunted. "Then where's the girl? A neighbour swears she turned this way." "Observe," Holmes said, pointing. The steps were dark with moisture, save one patch upon which a foot had recently pressed, the tread small and light. At the bottom, the river's edge was scuffed with marks where a box or parcel had been set down, then lifted again. "She came here, yes, but she did not enter the water. She delivered what she bore, then went on. See the cartwheel ruts leading off towards Blackfriars? Fresh, narrow, likely a coster's cart. Our girl met her confederate here." "But was she willing, Holmes?" I asked. "Did she act from fear or loyalty?" Holmes's face hardened in the lamplight. "That is the question, Watson, upon which the honour of the Charteris family hangs. If she aided by choice, then the household nurtured a traitor. If by force, then we must seek her captor. Come, the tracks are fresh." We pursued them eastward, the cart's trail visible in the damp, where the iron-rimmed wheels had scored the softer patches of earth between cobbles. At a bend near a shuttered warehouse, Holmes raised his hand. A sound had reached us, the faint, plaintive note of a barrel organ. It came from within the warehouse itself, muffled, halting, and eerily similar in timbre to the broken music box from the Charteris drawing-room. Holmes pressed himself to the wall, listening with eyes half closed. "The same tune," he whispered. "Crude, but recognizable. That melody links Annie's glove with varnish from such an instrument. It is no coincidence." Lestrade signalled the constable, and together they forced the door. The hinges shrieked, the music ceased, and a startled cry rang out. Within, beneath the dim flicker of a single lamp, crouched Annie Rowntree. She clutched a small parcel to her breast, her face drawn with fear. Before her, upon a crate, sat a barrel organ, its handle half-turned, as though abandoned in haste. "Annie!" I exclaimed, stepping forward, but Holmes's hand shot out to restrain me. He advanced alone, his voice calm yet commanding. "Child, you have placed yourself in grave danger. That parcel you carry, deliver it if you value your life." She shook her head violently. "I cannot, sir. They said if I disobeyed, they would kill him." "Kill whom?" Holmes demanded. "Mr. St. Clair," she sobbed. "They took him from the house last night, forced me to write notes, to carry this box here. They said the jewels would follow, but I swear I never touched them." Holmes took the parcel gently. He opened it, revealing not jewels but papers, deeds, securities, all bearing the hand of Phineas Vale. His eyes gleamed. "So, the tiara was but a lure, the true prize financial. Vale contrived this plot using you as courier and scapegoat. And St. Clair, where is he held?" "They brought him here," Annie whispered, pointing towards a rear chamber. Lestrade rushed forward, flinging the door open. There, bound to a chair, but unharmed save for a bruise upon his temple, sat Arthur St. Clair. He raised his head with weary relief. "Holmes!" he gasped. In a moment we had cut his bonds, and Watson, that is, myself, saw to the wound, which was trifling. Holmes regarded him keenly. "You were struck from behind as you left the dining-room last night, were you not?" St. Clair nodded. "I was lured by a note said to come from Evelyn, begging a word in secret. Then a blow and darkness. When I woke, I was here." Holmes turned back to Lestrade. "You see, the pattern is plain. Vale engineered the quarrel at dinner, then forged the note, and abducted St. Clair to delay the wedding and mask his scheme. Lionel, drawn in by curiosity or weak loyalty, tampered with the crown and thus muddled the stage. Annie was coerced into carrying securities to his accomplice, the shattered tiara, the forged note, the vanished maid. Each piece fits." Lestrade's jaw set grimly. "Vale will answer for this, and any accomplice with him." Holmes inclined his head. "Secure St. Clair and the girl, then. I have one final chord to strike before this melody resolves. Vale must not yet suspect that his tune is played out." And with that, he closed the barrel organ with a snap, its echo sharp in the empty warehouse, and stepped back into the fog with that air of anticipation, which I knew well. The game, though its outlines were now visible, had yet to yield its final revelation, and Holmes moved towards it, as a hound scenting the quarry, relentless and unswerving. We conveyed Mr. St. Clair and Annie Rowntree back through the fog with a sense that the tide of events was turning at last. Lestrade dispatched his constable with the rescued papers to the yard for safe-keeping, while Holmes walked beside me in a silence broken only by the creak of the carriage wheels and the distant wash of the Thames. Annie, pale and trembling, leaned against me for comfort, her eyes fixed upon the floor, as though fearful that even the pavement might betray her. St. Clair, though bruised and weary, bore himself with a composure that revealed more steel in his character than I had hitherto credited him with. Holmes, however, remained withdrawn, his fingers tapping lightly against the violin case in his lap, as though playing some inaudible measure only he could hear. At Belgrave, Mews, Sir Peregrine met us upon the steps, his face a study of mingled relief and dread. Evelyn, rushing forward, clasped St. Clair's hands with a cry that pierced even Lestrade's gruff composure. "Arthur, you are safe!" The young man, with evident effort, smiled and reassured her, though the shadows about his eyes told of his ordeal. Holmes, meanwhile, raised a hand for silence. "Sir Peregrine," he said evenly, "we must gather all concerned in your drawing-room at once. The time has come when certain illusions must be dispelled." Within a quarter of an hour, the family and its circle were assembled. Sir Peregrine, Grim and pale, Lady Agnes, stiff as carved ivory, Lucenal restless, his wounded hand hidden again. Vale, summoned from his office by Lestrade's men, his lips pressed to a thin line of composure. Holmes stood before the mantel, his gaze sweeping the company with that air of quiet command that none could resist. I took my place at his side, notebook in hand, while Lestrade leaned with folded arms at the door, his eyes alert to every twitch and gesture. Holmes began in that deliberate tone which I have come to recognize as the prelude to revelation. This affair, though clothed in mystery, resolves itself into a pattern of great simplicity once the misleading threads are untangled. At its heart lies no romance of jewels, but a scheme of finance. Mr. Vale, entrusted with the management of the Charteris estates, saw in Miss Charteris's impending marriage a danger to his position. Certain securities which he had transferred to purposes of his own would shortly come under scrutiny. The marriage meant exposure. The solution, as he conceived it, was to delay the ceremony and cover his traces. He arranged the abduction of Mr. St. Clair, employing hired hands, and coercing the maid Annie into service as a messenger. The forged note, typed upon his own machine, removed suspicion from himself and accounted for the bridegroom's absence. A murmur ran through the room, but Holmes raised his hand for quiet. The tiara, however, presented an unforeseen complication. Mr. Lionel Charteris, led by curiosity or by influence, entered the dressing-room, handled the crown, and damaged it. His cut thumb and the silk upon the balcony rail betray him. The fragments and the smear of lamp oil were then arranged to suggest intrusion from without, and Annie was made the scapegoat. Yet the music box varnish upon her glove, the forged note, the securities in her parcel, all point straight to Mr. Vale. Vale's composure cracked at last. "This is monstrous!" he cried. "You rely upon guesses and coincidences." Holmes's eyes glittered. "Coincidences, sir, do not align so neatly. Your own ashtray held the burnt fragment of a letter concerning insurance for the tiara, proof that you meant the crown to play its part in your deception, and the faint heliotrope upon Annie's parcel betrayed Lady Agnes, who, whether from loyalty to her nephew or from resentment of the marriage, lent tacit aid. Lionel, I do not doubt, was but a dupe, a tool in more subtle hands. But you, Mr. Vale, forged the note, planned the abduction, and sought to profit from both securities and scandal." Sir Peregrine rose with a groan. "Vale, you indeed betrayed me?" Before the man could frame an answer, Holmes stepped closer. His voice fell to a softer pitch, and his gaze was fixed not upon Vale, but upon Lady Agnes. "Yet there remains one final chord, for the hand that guided Lionel, that pressed Annie with threats, that turned Vale's ambition into action, was yours, Lady
Agnes. A collective gasp shook the company. Lady Agnes stiffened, her lips parting, then closing again in rigid silence. Holmes continued, merciless and precise. "The heliotrope upon Annie's glove came not from herself, but from you when you pressed the parcel into her keeping. Your disdain for the tiara was but mask for your deeper motive, to prevent the marriage of Evelyn and St. Clair, and thereby keep the Charteris fortune within your own influence. Vale was your instrument, Lionel your pawn. The entire play was of your contriving, though you cloaked it beneath others' hands." For a moment, no one stirred. Then Lady Agnes gave a low, bitter laugh. "Ah, so the great detective unmasks me. And what will you do, sir? Parade this family shame before the world? You cannot prove what passed in whispers, in glances, in urgings, too subtle for record." Holmes's expression did not alter. "Proof enough exists. The pearl, pinched by a tool in hands that smelled of heliotrope, the parcel you touched, the maid's testimony, the securities veil carried. Together they weave a net from which even whispers cannot slip. Lestrade, you have your charge. Lestrade stepped forward, his hand firm upon Vale's shoulder, but his eyes flicked uneasily towards Lady Agnes, uncertain whether to include her in his duty. Sir Peregrine lifted his hand, his voice trembling. Spare her. Let the scandal end with Vale. My sister's guilt is punishment enough. Holmes inclined his head, yet his eyes remained fixed upon Lady Agnes, who had turned away, her face hidden in the folds of her handkerchief. Mercy is your prerogative, Sir Peregrine, he said quietly. My task is fulfilled. With that he gathered his coat about him and strode towards the door. I followed, leaving the Charteris household to its grief and reckoning. Outside, the fog swirled as though eager to swallow the house and its secrets. Holmes lit his pipe, his face shadowed by the glow. Watson, he said, it is ever the same. Men think jewels or papers the prize, but it is influence that drives the hand. The tiara was shattered long before it lay broken upon the velvet. And with that enigmatic remark, he turned his steps towards Baker Street as the night closed in behind us. The cab bore us back to Baker Street in silence, the fog thickening so that even the lamps glowed like dim embers against the night. Holmes had sunk deep into the corner, pipe unlit, his eyes fixed upon the shifting veil beyond the window, as though he saw not the street, but the intricate design that lay beneath the entire affair. I ventured no question, for I knew too well the intensity of that state when his mind was wound tight as a spring, and the least interruption might snap its thread. Only when we reached the familiar threshold of number 221B did he stir, mounting the stairs with sudden energy, flinging aside his coat and throwing himself into his armchair as though the very seat was part of
the machinery of his thought. I had scarcely drawn the curtains against the fog when Holmes spoke abruptly. Watson, there is a discordant note still sounding. The matter is not concluded. You astonish me, I replied. The securities are recovered. St. Clair is safe, Annie cleared of guilt, and Vale exposed as the chief villain. What remains? Holmes leaned forward, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. That, my dear fellow, is the precise question. You heard Lady Agnes, her cold defiance, her assertion that whispers cannot be proven. She yielded too readily. A woman of her pride would not laugh at exposure unless she held some deeper card yet unplayed. The pattern is incomplete. I see the frame, but there is a missing piece which, if left unattended, will render the entire picture false. Before I could reply, there came a knock, urgent and hesitant. Mrs. Hudson entered with a boy, none other than the wiry urchin Wiggins, leader of Holmes's Baker Street irregulars. He tugged his cap and produced a crumpled slip of paper. "Beg pardon, Mr. Holmes. A message come through the yard. Thought you'd want it quick." Holmes snatched it, his eyes flashing as he read. He handed it to me without a word. It was scrawled in Lestrade's familiar hand. Vale denies all knowledge of the securities, claims they were forced upon him, insists Lady Agnes directed the scheme, requests immediate confrontation urgent. Holmes sprang to his feet. As I thought, Vale is no mastermind, merely an accomplice. The true instigator has yet to be unmasked. Watson, coat and revolver. We return to Belgrave Mews at once. The cab flew through the fog once more, and in less than half an hour we were ushered into the Charteris drawing-room, where the scene had shifted as if the play were in a new act. Vale sat pale but resolute, guarded by two constables, while Lady Agnes stood near the hearth, her posture rigid, her eyes glittering with a strange triumph. Sir Peregrine slumped in his chair, Evelyn clasping her fiancé's hand beside him, the girl's face drawn with worry, but lit by relief. Lestrade, looking harassed, gestured for Holmes to take command. "Mr. Holmes," Vale began bitterly, "you know I am no saint. Yet I swear upon my life I never struck St. Clair, nor planned his abduction. The papers were thrust upon me by Lady Agnes herself, with orders to conceal them and misdirect suspicion. I was weak enough to comply, but I am no architect of this villainy." Lady Agnes gave a low laugh. "The man lies to save his neck. Why should I, a woman of standing, stoop to such machinations?" Holmes's gaze fixed upon her with an intensity that seemed to strip the very walls away. "Because you feared," he said softly. "You feared the loss of your influence, the descent of the Charteris fortune into the hands of Evelyn and her husband. Vale was your instrument, Lionel your puppet, Annie your scapegoat. But there is more. You sought
not only to delay the marriage, but to discredit it utterly. That is why you arranged the abduction in such a way that suspicion might fall upon St. Clair himself. Had your plot succeeded, the family would have cast him off as dishonored, and Evelyn would be left once more beneath your control." Her face twitched, the mask of coldness slipping for an instant. "You cannot prove it." Holmes's voice sharpened. "I can, for you left behind the one piece you could not erase, the spring of a repeater watch found by Miss Charteris before she entered her dressing room. That watch is yours, Lady Agnes. I recall seeing its chain at supper 2 nights ago, gold twisted with a jet bead. The spring ran down as you forced the lock from within, betraying your presence even as you sought to mask it with the music box. There was a collective stir. Sir Peregrine looked up sharply, his eyes stricken. "Agnes, is this true?" Her lips parted, closed, and parted again, as though words themselves had deserted her. At last she spoke in a whisper that trembled with both pride and despair. "I did it for the family, to keep us from ruin, to prevent Evelyn from throwing herself away upon a man whose fortune is shallow and whose prospects I mistrust. I used Vale, I guided Lionel, I threatened the maid. Yes, yes, I did it all, and I would have succeeded had it not been for him." She gestured with a bitter sneer towards Holmes. Evelyn cried out, rushing to her father's side. "Uncle Lionel was but your tool, Annie your victim. You would have destroyed Arthur for your own pride." Holmes raised his hand, his tone grave, but without triumph. "The law will determine your punishment, Lady Agnes. Yet I tell you this, you erred in thinking that truth may be smothered by whispers and appearances. Truth, like the pearl you sought to mar, shines still beneath the stain." Lestrade stepped forward, his face stern. "Lady Agnes Charteris, I must place you under arrest." Sir Peregrine groaned, burying his face in his hands, while Evelyn clung fiercely to her betrothed. Vale, though guilty of weakness, seemed almost relieved that the full burden had shifted from him. Lionel, pale and trembling, slipped into a chair as though realizing at last the depth of the game in which he had been ensnared. Holmes, satisfied that the final veil had been lifted, touched my arm. "Come, Watson, our work here is done. Let the yard conclude what we have uncovered. The night grows long, and I fancy a pipe by our own hearth will serve better company than further lamentations." And so, leaving behind the wails of Evelyn and the heavy silence of Sir Peregrine, we stepped once more into the fog-bound streets, the case of the shattered crown, complete in its revelation, though leaving behind it the bitterness of truth too long concealed. The fog clung to us as we turned into Baker Street, the lamplight flickering weakly above, and I confess my heart was heavy despite the triumph of our investigation. The Charteris family was left fractured, its honour preserved outwardly, but inwardly torn by betrayal, and I could not help but pity Sir Peregrine and his daughter, who must live with the knowledge of kinship turned to treachery. Holmes, however, showed none of my sentiment.
Once, in our sitting room, he cast aside his coat, lit his pipe with swift precision, and paced the hearthrug like a man whose mind, though satisfied in deduction, still revolved around deeper currents. "You are troubled, Watson," he said suddenly, as if reading my thoughts in the smoke. "I am," I admitted. It was victory, yes, but bitter. To see a woman of Lady Agnes's station fall so low, and to think of the pain her schemes inflicted, it chills me, Holmes. The law may act, but it cannot mend such wounds. Holmes blew a thin stream of smoke. The law does not mend, Watson, it only curtails. The wounds of pride, jealousy, and greed are as old as mankind. Our task is not to heal, but to illuminate, to make plain the hidden pattern. Once exposed, corruption withers of its own accord. I was about to answer when there came another knock, hurried and insistent. Mrs. Hudson ushered in Inspector Lestrade, his usually brisk demeanour shaken by urgency. He closed the door behind him and lowered his voice. "Holmes, I've come at once. Lady Agnes has not been conveyed to the yard. She feigned collapse and in the commotion slipped free. We searched the house, the grounds. Nothing. She has vanished into the city." Holmes's eyes flashed. He set his pipe aside and drew himself up with sudden energy. I expected as much. A spirit like hers does not submit quietly. Tell me, was her repeater watch recovered? No, Lestrade admitted, nor the key to her brother's strongbox. Holmes gave a short, satisfied nod. Precisely. She has not fled in despair, but in pursuit of some final stratagem. The game is not concluded, Watson. If she carries that key, she may yet attempt to secure or destroy the very documents that bear witness against her. The tiara was only symbol, the securities the bait. But there is another element still, an account perhaps, or a deed. Something she fears above all else may surface. Lestrade groaned. The yard will rouse the city, but in this fog she could be anywhere. Holmes was already at the window, peering into the swirling grey. "Not anywhere, Lestrade. She will move where the fog shields her, and where wealth may be converted swiftly into escape. The docks, Watson. A vessel for the continent sails with the tide. If she boards it with papers or jewels, the truth may yet slip from England's grasp." Within moments we were again in a cab, rattling eastward through the night. The streets grew narrower, the air thicker with coal smoke and tar, until at last the cries of sailors and the creak of rigging came through the gloom. The river lay black and heaving, lanterns glimmering like will-o'-the-wisps upon its restless surface. Holmes directed the driver to a halt and leapt down, striding along the wharf with Lestrade and myself at his heels. The fog swirled so thick that figures loomed and vanished like phantoms. At last, near a stack of barrels, Holmes caught my arm. "There, observe." Through the mist we discerned a woman's form, cloaked and veiled, speaking in urgent tones to a rough sailor who bore a small chest upon his shoulder. She pressed coins into his hand and pointed towards a moored vessel whose lamps shone faintly through the gloom. Even before her veil slipped, I knew it was Lady Agnes. Holmes moved with panther-like swiftness, intercepting her path. "Your flight is in vain, madam," he said sharply. "The river will not bear you beyond the reach of truth." She started, her eyes blazing in the lantern light. "You meddle once more, Mr. Holmes. This chest contains nothing of yours." Holmes's hand shot out and lifted the lid before she could protest. Within lay not jewels, but bundles of papers, seals broken, signatures exposed. The very securities Vale had claimed were thrust upon him, along with additional deeds I had not seen before. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he drew forth one document. "Watson, observe. Here lies the heart of the matter, an old trust naming Lady Agnes as sole guardian of Evelyn's dowry until her marriage. With these papers destroyed or altered, she could retain control indefinitely. Her motive is not merely pride, but power prolonged. Lestrade stepped forward grimly. That settles it. Lady Agnes, you'll come with me. She drew herself up, defiant to the last. You may drag me through the streets, but you cannot alter what is written in blood. The Charterist's name will never be free of my hand. Holmes replaced the papers with quiet finality. Names are but echoes, Lady Agnes. It is deeds that endure, and your deeds have spoken too loudly to be silenced. She made no further resistance as the constables led her away. The sailor melted into the fog, his coin clutched greedily, indifferent to the drama he had aided. Holmes stood a moment upon the wharf, gazing after the departing figure, then turned to me with that rare expression of weariness which only I have seen upon his features. So ends the play, Watson. The curtain falls at last. We have pursued the shadow through jewels, through papers, through blood and whispers, until it yielded its core, pride, jealousy, greed, always the same trilogy of motives. Yet each time it weaves a mask more elaborate than the last. We returned to Baker Street as dawn began to pale the fog. Weary but certain, the matter was now truly concluded. And as Holmes sank once more into his chair, violin resting upon his knee, he murmured, "Remember this case well, Watson, for it is not the tiara nor the securities that will be recalled, but the simple truth that the brightest crowns are often shattered by the darkest hands within a family's own house." The dawn crept pale through the fog as we returned to Baker Street, the air thick with that peculiar stillness which comes when night has spent its fury, and the city has not yet roused itself. Holmes flung himself into his chair with a weariness I seldom witnessed, drawing the violin across his knees and plucking absently at a string, as though the vibration steadied his thought. I, for my part, sank into the opposite chair, fatigue pressing heavily upon me, yet my mind still whirled with the events of the night. The vision of Lady Agnes, proud even in her downfall, haunted me, and I could not silence the echo of her last bitter words. Holmes broke the silence. "You observe, Watson, how pride blinds itself even at the moment of exposure. Lady Agnes sought to wield her family's honour as both shield and sword, yet in so doing she shattered it more completely than any outside hand could have done." I nodded. "And yet, Holmes, I cannot help but feel there is tragedy in it. She was misguided, yes, but her motive, if not excused, was born of fear. Fear of losing control, fear of change, fear that the family would decline without her. Pride is a cruel master, but she was its servant, not its author." Holmes inclined his head with a faint smile. "You are ever the moralist, my dear fellow, and therein lies your strength. It is good that one of us remembers the heart even as the other dissects the brain. Still, the case is not yet closed, for there remains the matter of Vale and Lionel. Both are ensnared, but their roles differ. One may yet redeem himself, the other must learn the cost of weakness." I was about to reply when another knock startled us. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a telegram. Holmes tore it open and scanned it swiftly. His brows arched, and he passed it across to me. The message, signed by Lestrade, read, "Lady Agnes secured. Vale confesses partial guilt, claims he acted under duress of blackmail. Lionel begs clemency, reveals knowledge of secret meetings at warehouse predating scheme. Suggest your immediate presence for clarification." Holmes leapt to his feet. "Watson, it is precisely as I anticipated. Lady Agnes was the architect, but she had need of tools. Vale's weakness was obvious, but duress, that is another matter entirely. And Lionel's confession of secret meetings suggests an accomplice yet unconsidered. The web has one more strand. We lost no time, and within the hour we were again at the yard, where Lestrade received us with an air of mingled relief and perplexity. In a bare chamber, Vale sat slumped, his hands clasped, his face pale but resolute. Lionel, by contrast, paced like a caged animal, his eyes darting, his hands still bound with its black silk. "Holmes," Lestrade began, "Vale insists Lady Agnes threatened him with exposure of certain debts if he did not comply. He admits to forging the note, but swears the securities were pressed upon him by her. Lionel claims he overheard the meeting with another party, a man he cannot name, but describes as coarse, foreign, and given to carrying a barrel organ. That, you'll note, matches the instrument found in the warehouse." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Excellent, Lestrade. We approach the final curtain. The barrel organ player is no random hireling. He is the thread that connects Annie, the warehouse, and the entire masquerade. Lady Agnes may have conceived the play, but she employed this accomplice to carry out its baser mechanics. Vale's debts made him pliant, Lionel's vanity made him careless, Annie's loyalty made her vulnerable. But the hand that struck Sinclair and conveyed him to the riverside warehouse was this man?" Lionel halted in his pacing. "I swear, Holmes, I heard her speak his name, but it was foreign, harsh. Grigor, or something akin. He laughed when she scolded him, and she threatened that even he could be discarded. He only laughed the more." Holmes tapped his fingers together, his eyes half closed. "A foreign hireling with a barrel organ, skilled enough to force locks and strong enough to subdue a man of Sinclair's build. It is an old pattern, Watson. Such men drift through London's fog like phantoms, unseen until they are summoned by those with money and malice. He is the last stone unturned." Lestrade frowned. "But Agnes is under lock now. What if this Grigor takes flight?" "He will not," Holmes said firmly, "for such men are drawn to danger as moths to flame. He will attempt to recover what remains, papers, jewels, vengeance. And when he does, we shall be waiting. The question is not whether he returns, but where." Holmes turned sharply to Vale. "Sir, where did Lady Agnes first encounter this man? You must know." Vale hesitated, then sighed. "She brought him once to my office. She said he was useful for errands beneath her station. I objected, but she silenced me. He spoke little English, but I heard him mutter of the docks. He kept a lodging near Shadwell." Holmes's eyes flashed with triumph. "Just so, the docks once more. Lestrade, we must post watch there at once. Grigor is the final actor, and when the curtain falls, it must fall upon him." Arrangements were swiftly made. That very night, accompanied by a small detachment of constables, we returned to the labyrinth of warehouses and alleys where the Thames lapped darkly at its banks. The fog swirled thicker than ever, muffling sound and making each lantern appear as a distant star. Holmes, his cane in hand, led us with unerring certainty to a derelict warehouse whose door hung crooked upon its hinges. He raised his hand, and we waited in tense silence. Then, faint at first, but growing clearer, came the melancholy wheeze of a barrel organ, its notes grotesquely jaunty against the night's chill. A shadow loomed through the mist, a hulking figure with the instrument strapped to his chest. His stride was heavy, his shoulders broad, his beard unkempt. There could be no doubt this was the man Lionel had described. Holmes stepped forward, his voice cutting through the fog like steel. "Good evening, Grigor. Your mistress has been unmasked, your schemes undone. The game is over." The man snarled, dropping the organ with a crash and drawing a blade from within his coat. With a guttural curse he lunged, but Lestrade's men surged forward. There was a struggle, brief but violent, steel flashing in the lantern light, the fog resounding with shouts. In the end, The blade was wrenched away and the man pinned against the wall, roaring his fury in a tongue none of us understood. Holmes alone remained calm, brushing dust from his sleeve, as if the skirmish were no more than a trifle. "So," he said softly, "the last mask is torn away. Lady Agnes wove the plot, but this man was its arm. With him secured, the case is complete." As Grigor was dragged away in irons, Holmes turned to me, his eyes bright with that peculiar fire which only the chase could kindle. "Observe, Watson, how each conspiracy, however elaborate, relies at last upon brute force. It is the brute that betrays the scheme. Lady Agnes might have escaped with whispers and forgeries, but she trusted a heavy hand, and heavy hands always leave their mark." I could not deny the truth of his words, though my heart was heavy for the ruin left behind. The Charteris crown was broken, its fragments restored but never whole, just as the family itself must remain scarred by betrayal. Yet Holmes, unmoved by sentiment, had brought the truth to light, and as the fog curled once more around the lamplight, I knew I had witnessed another of his triumphs, one born not of jewels or securities, but of unmasking the darkest motives that dwell within the human heart. The capture of the barrel organ player marked the final stroke in the case. Yet, as we stood in the damp alley, with the fog curling about our boots, I sensed Holmes was far from satisfied. He stood motionless, his long fingers steepled against his lips, while Lestrade's men bound the foreigner and led him away, their lanterns throwing grotesque shadows upon the brick walls. "It is finished, Holmes," Lestrade declared, wiping his brow with relief. "The lady in custody, her accomplice secured. What more can be done?" Holmes's eyes glinted through the fog. "Inspector, to declare a case concluded before the last note is sounded is to leave the symphony incomplete. We have grasped the hand, the pawns and the instrument, but we have not yet turned the crown of the matter in the light. There remains the question of motive in its purest form, not mere pride, not only greed, but the precise trigger that led Lady Agnes to play so desperate a game." Lestrade muttered that lawyers might concern themselves with motive, but Holmes shook his head with impatience. Without motive clear, the narrative collapses. The pearl upon the tiara. Watson is dull in part because of lamp oil, yes, but also because a hand pressed it hard, a hand that feared the weight of exposure. Lady Agnes did not act for Evelyn alone, nor for the family fortune. There is something deeper concealed in those papers. We returned to Baker Street, Holmes carrying with him the chest of recovered documents. The dawn broke more decisively now, paling the fog into shreds that drifted above the chimney tops. Once in our sitting room, Holmes spread the papers across the table, his eyes glittering with the keen light of analysis. I read over his shoulder, recognizing deeds, bonds, and securities whose technicalities were beyond me. Yet Holmes's gaze darted among them like a hawk, settling at last upon a folded parchment with faded ink. "Ah," he exclaimed softly, "here lies the spring of all." He spread it flat, revealing an older trust dated some 20 years prior. It declared that in the event of Sir Peregrine's death, guardianship of Evelyn and her inheritance should fall jointly to Lady Agnes and a cousin long deceased. "Do you perceive, Watson?" Holmes asked. "Lady Agnes once held true authority over the Charteris fortune. With Evelyn grown to marriageable age, that authority must pass. She feared not only loss of influence, but exposure of irregularities committed during her tenure. Her control of those funds was not as scrupulous as she pretended. The marriage threatened to unearth discrepancies, perhaps even misappropriations. Thus, she conceived a plot to shatter both crown and bridegroom in one stroke. I felt a chill as I considered it. Then her motive was double: retain control and conceal her misdeeds. Precisely. Vale's debts made him her tool, Lionel her shield, Annie her courier, and Grigor her enforcer. Each piece moved by her hand, each strand woven into her design. But the true origin lies in that old trust, Watson. The law will now grasp not only the crime, but the reason behind it. By midday, Lestrade arrived to collect the documents, his manner unusually deferential. "Holmes, I'll grant it. You've tied the knot as tight as any rope at Newgate. With this trust and her confession, the court will have no doubt. The accomplices will meet their due portion, but Lady Agnes's name will be writ darkest." Holmes inclined his head with the faintest smile. "It is not for me to determine justice, Inspector. I supply the facts. The law may hang them with its own rope." When the yard had departed and the flat grew quiet once more, I could not restrain my feelings. "Holmes, this case has left me more melancholy than any I recall. A family broken from within, a crown shattered not by thieves, but by those sworn to guard it. Is there not some lesson in it?" Holmes had resumed his seat, the violin resting lightly beneath his chin. He drew the bow across the strings in a long, low note, then answered in that detached tone that yet carried a trace of reflection. "The lesson, Watson, is that the grandest houses conceal the deepest fissures. Pride builds walls, but within those walls resentment festers. We must never marvel that a tiara is crushed, for gold is brittle. Rather, we should marvel that truth, though veiled in fog, always shines through. That is the crown which endures." He fell then into music, a sombre strain that seemed to echo the sorrows of the Charteris household, while I sat in silence, pen already stirring to record the affair. Outside, the city began to stir, carts rattling upon the stones, voices calling through the thinning mist. Another case was ended, its threads gathered and tied by Holmes's relentless mind, though its shadows would linger upon those who lived it. As the last note of Holmes's violin faded, he lowered the bow and gave a rare smile. "Watson, you may title this one as you please, perhaps The Bride's Shattered Crown. For though the jewel is broken, the truth lies polished at its heart." And thus I closed my notebook, resolved that the tale should be preserved, not for scandal nor for idle curiosity, but as another testament to the genius of my friend, whose eye could pierce fog and deceit alike, and who, though often accused of coldness, had once more saved honour, where honour seemed most lost. The days following Lady Agnes's arrest passed with a strange quietness, as though the storm that had shaken the Charteris household had at last exhausted itself. The newspapers made much of the scandal, of course, yet the family's dignity was preserved by Sir Peregrine's refusal to indulge the press. Evelyn and Mr. St. Clair, though their wedding delayed, were at last united some weeks later, the ceremony marked not by ostentation, but by an earnest simplicity that seemed all the more touching for the trials they had endured. Annie Rowntree was restored to her post, her loyalty vindicated, and Lionel, chastened and humbled, departed for the Continent, where Sir Peregrine hoped distance and reflection might cure him of his weaknesses. Vale, spared the severest judgment for his cooperation, sank into obscurity. His career ended. As for Lady Agnes, she remained a figure cloaked in silence, her name spoken in whispers, her haughty pride finally subdued by the very truth she had sought so desperately to suppress. She had gambled with blood and honour, and the reckoning was merciless. Holmes, though outwardly detached, allowed himself one reflective observation as he and I sat before our fire, the case closed at last. "You see, Watson, how fragile the crowns of men and women truly are. Jewels may dazzle, papers may bind, but the faintest crack of pride or envy can bring them to ruin. In the end, the tiara was but a symbol, its fragments reflecting the fractures already within that house. What endured was not gold, but truth, and truth, though often late, will always prevail. He leaned back, the faintest smile curving his lips as though the matter already belonged to the catalogue of memory. And I, gazing at him in that moment, felt again the familiar awe at the strange combination of intellect and detachment that defined him, my friend, Sherlock Holmes. Thus ends the case of the bride's shattered crown, a tale of ambition, deception, and pride undone, yet also of love's endurance and the relentless clarity of a mind that could strip away fog to reveal the sharp light of truth.